Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we have another speed paint where I will be looking more at a character, with a partial focus on the detail and the environment. With this one, we have a fair amount to discuss here as well, since there was a lot that went into the development of this, including a very real chance very early on that I was going to scrap the idea and look at something else entirely. So shall we get straight into it today? This idea began one night on a whim, really. I had been sketching different poses and references as a form of practice late one evening, and that was whilst I was watching something to just pass the time as well. I didn't really think that it would lead to much or equate to anything larger, since it is something I do fairly regularly, and it does just remain as a practice 9 times out of 10. I may have a few poses in the process that I think would be cool to include at a later date, or to maybe use in some form, but it is rare that I would take it further in that moment. It's usually more the process where I later have an idea that I want to look at, and the pose tends to fit that once I look back. Maybe in the moment I will have to shift an arm or a leg, look again at the face, or something about the sketch originally that would need altering to fit the idea perfectly. But that is all expected as part of the process. This time, however, one of the poses really strongly reminded me of a marionette. It looked like a puppet on strings the more that I worked on the pose, and it kind of planted this seed to consider maybe looking into it. Naturally, for that evening, I tried to move on and reconsider what I was doing, since I didn't see many ways that I could take it in that minute. I mean, yes, a puppet on strings would be fun and interesting, but there is a drawing I've done like it before, and I did want to consider more options for the next drawing that I would be working on anyway, just before I got stuck down one avenue. Besides, I also had poses there that reminded me of a music box that I had also been surrounding a few ideas for, that I wanted to look at the next day. So in the end, I decided nothing that night, and kind of let myself continue sketching and move on. A couple of days later, on the other hand, well, that one was where I began sketching this idea the first few times, and also where the process became a little bit rocky. At first I wanted to look at the idea of a puppet breaking free of this control in these strings. And I mean, it made sense. In the past I've drawn plenty of images where the puppets are still on the strings, and there are various implications to be had in those sections as well. Yet, what about the opposite? I felt that I could take it in a few ways where this puppet could have been existing on their own terms, maybe performing how they would want to as part of this, or simply breaking away from the sense of control this imagery is usually associated with. Another idea I had for the early phase had then been using string imagery more than anything. I felt that it would be interesting to change the environment to something relating to nature and space, whilst then using the strings and doll imagery to implicate it as a puppet becoming free of previous control. It took away an element of the performance, but it looked a lot more at themes of breaking free and moving away from that than anything else. And okay, both of these completely moved away from the original poses that I would have had to work with for them, but it would have been interesting and more fun than the original intent of a puppet on strings and being trapped by them. So I spent a few more sketchbook pages trying to work that one out too, whilst almost arguing with myself over which route that I would end up taking. At this point the natural one felt more fun and entertaining, and I felt that I could do more with it than any other. So in a way I went down that route. I explored how I could display it as a puppet on strings despite the fact that she was then away from the theatre typical of these puppets, and also kind of having her away from any common imagery associated with the marionette theming. Those sketches then gained imagery of hands instead, some of which were connected to cut or snapped strings, and others that were simply decoration. I looked at how it could all come together in terms of background, and how I could show the feelings that were almost central to the entire idea. But it just didn't work. I didn't like it. I actually sketched it about 5 separate times on paper and another 10 digitally, and nothing worked. I actually started to hate the idea. I didn't like the pose or the environment, and everything was muddled together since the image had too much going on, and with the details as well, it would have had even more going on that I didn't like or want for it. I had a doll, strings and a hand, I then had the feelings and environment to work out and how I would go about doing all of that at once. And it really all became a little bit too much with the sketches that I had been working on. And that wasn't even getting started on the colour palettes and introducing any of that element to it. That actually was when I did the sketch and drawing for the last video. I took a far step back from it as I actually believed I would abandon this idea entirely at this point, in favour of other things, since this one just wasn't working no matter how hard I tried. In any shape or form it wouldn't come together, and I actually found out that the more I tried to make it work, I started to hate it more and more. So naturally I needed to move away and focus on something else in its entirety, as this one wasn't going anywhere and it wouldn't have helped me at all in any shape. I did the other drawing at this point, and I had fun with it. Then, only at the end of it all, did I think of revisiting this idea, since it took up so many pages in my sketchbook that I couldn't help but notice it again. At this point it occupied about 3 or 4 pages, and I felt that I could maybe do something with it at the very least if I went back to square one. It may not have been to the same level that I originally thought of it, but I could potentially look at it again, and as I've said, start over. And that's kind of what I ended up doing. Instead of anything else, I went back to square one, and I ignored anything that I had developed for later in the earlier processes. I literally just didn't look at it, and instead decided to treat it as if this was an entirely new idea that I'd just started to work on, and figured that if the previous route promised interesting again, then I would start over with new ideas for it without following the last path. I also figured that if it didn't prove interesting, then the other route was just the one that would be better explored. If I came up with a new route, then I'd follow it, and I wouldn't strictly keep myself to the old ideas. However, from the very start, another route shined with a little more promise. See, originally I had been looking at a marionette for a wider concept. I wanted to use them to look at themes of control, and I realised that the image was more reliant on themes and concepts than I had otherwise been getting lost between one another. It was an idea that I feel now would have been more equipped for a painting rather than this style of work, since I typically approach them both very differently. Though, in truth, I could make an entirely separate video to unpack all of why I approach them differently and why it may be. Anyway though, this time I wanted to shelve the themes and concepts and instead look at more at potential stories that I could be telling instead, and kind of approach it more with a narrative in mind than anything else. When working digital, I don't mind overarching themes for images or ideas that I could approach. I don't tend to favour them, yet I'm not wholly against them. I instead typically prefer a narrative and a story to tell that I could try and convey in the image with gaps that are open to interpretation. And this one kind of changed how I looked at this idea. Instead of using a doll, I could use a person, since the ideas and themes of a doll had been overcrowding the piece, and it didn't sit right with me anyway. I could look at how a person would fit into this story and what the idea of the strings may be present for them here. I could look at and decide if I wanted to keep the performance angle, or maybe if I wanted to look at more of a mundane scene with the strings stood out that little bit more. Basically, in short, doing this opened a lot of doors that had previously closed. The mundane scene was something that I set aside for a later time. I could maybe look at it in a range of ways, so it kind of sparked its own branch of ideas that didn't entirely work for this time. I instead decided that the performance element said a lot more, and it kind of gave me multiple ways for the story to go and be interpreted from. From a single thing of a person performing whilst wrapped in strings, I could kind of leave the rest open for interpretation. In one vein, it may be a puppet come to life and performing on their own terms for once, as I've mentioned before. It could also be a far simpler story of a person choosing this appearance for a show, but even that simple route leaves questions as to why they'd want this and so on. To make a long point short, I wanted to leave it open but not close it off too much so that people draw their own conclusions from it, which is really part of why I enjoy doing this narrative drawing so often. So with those bits established, I could then look at the outfit and the details for the piece, though those would be better discussed in depth later on like I usually tend to. Once I had them sorted, however, I could move into the outlines for terms of process. It is rare these days that I choose to use them, but it felt right for this time, since there were so many small details that would otherwise get lost between everything around it. It would also make the flat colours easier at that stage and overall suited this image more than the lineless approach would have, which is really just part of why I did it as well. I also just decided that I wanted something with lines again, so it just kind of went and happened from there. I almost want to experiment with the lines again in a way. For this one I kept them very simple and direct since I know this process and it didn't really take me too long, all things considered. Yet, knowing the process and being so familiar with it is what's making me consider experimenting or trying something new about it all. It's familiar by now, and art for me is all about trying something new, so who knows? I may try a somewhat different approach soon enough, since this one almost proves to me how familiar it is by now, despite the fact that I don't include them a lot. Though, again, I started working without them since that was an experiment, and now I'm also very used to that. The lines also meant that I had a layer of reference when it came to the flats. It sort of meant that I had an easier time to sort of lay it all out and mess with the colours that I would want or not across the page, and that was without having to use the neons like I usually would have defaulted to. Though you will notice that I still colour them in by hand rather than relying on the fill bucket tool, and that's just because I can't work out what settings the fill tool needs to be set on for my work. It always leaves little white gaps that drive me up the wall, so that is something I'm still working out as well. In terms of working out the colours themselves, I knew that the environment was a theatre, as chosen to help tell the story. It kind of gave me a strong starting point for the palette this time though, as I typically think of red curtains for a theatre and wooden stages, which meant that I would want to show this via the palette and so on, just so that everything else stood out. It only meant that for the threads and the person I would need to work out a colour that went well with it and complemented everything, since I had a strong starting point. I didn't want it to be monochrome, so I knew that red was off the table, alongside anything like pink or orange, as they'd be way too close to red once shading and it all looked too similar. I could use them, don't get me wrong, but not as a primary part of the palette this time. So I shifted it quite a bit to pair it with this green sort of blue. Originally I thought it blue and thought it worked, yet I then shifted the colours closer and closer towards green until it sits between the two whilst complementing the red quite well. I mean, it wasn't the only reason I chose this too. I knew I sketched in the details of the chains across the dress, which meant I knew that I would be typically tying in gold and silver, and I was only tying in them both so that it wasn't entirely one note, and also since I knew that I had the padlocks that would use them both. With the silver being grey and colder, I looked at a blue to tie this in, and the green hue complements red rather well, which kind of meant it all came together over time and came together quite easily. The only two exceptions to this is the skin tone and the hair. With the skin, it was a bit of a holdover from the doll idea, where I wanted them really pale, since they were originally meant to look like a doll and not carry over a natural tone. For this one, however, I did add a little bit more colour to it as a sort of balance, but I still kept it really pale. And this, again, also helped in a way pull them out of the darker background around them. As for the hair, I wanted to tie in the red into it, and ginger was a very strong contender for this one palette, as it kind of just fit everything as well, and it brought in the red curtains to the character, and had that little bit of overlap that I had been looking for. But from there I had to go into the shading process of everything, which is again fairly direct like always. Instead, let's actually discuss those details that I skipped over before, as they do add rather well to the story and the character as a whole. The first of the details that I want to discuss here are the threads, as these are central to the idea and were really the first part of everything that had me return to looking at this, and it was also the part that made me feel as if I could do something with it. See, originally in this piece they would be rising into the ceiling. They'd still be connected to whatever it is that would make the puppet move and dance, and I felt that that would quite clearly tell someone part of the story. That route could have been interesting as well, since I had moved more to make the doll human, Yet that was then just less fun than having them cut short and free, as they added more interest when flowing around the character and kind of showing them with that movement. And in a way, just having them show that motion really pushed this route into my favour. I then looked at other ways that I could include it. I mean, I was happy with it so far, but felt that it was hard to see or notice, and it really wasn't too noticeable compared to everything else going on. So I wanted to look at how I could include it in the environment as well, which is where the starting of the framing of the image kind of came into it. I already had the darker border with everything around it, so I wanted to look at how I could potentially add to this, and tie the threads into it at the same time. I did so later with one detail I will mention next, but the first way that I added to the frame had been the strings around the outsides, and I felt that it tied it in much better than I otherwise had at this point. These details were more for appearance than anything. I felt that it made the image look more complete than necessarily adding anything to the story or the other ideas that I had established at that point either. It could add to it for someone, but my main motivator for it was the appearance before all else, and it worked especially well later down the line. The glow behind them kind of balanced the darker border I had established, and it also balanced the next detail that I will be discussing here in a second. Now, this next detail wasn't the next one in order. In fact, it wasn't even planned at any point of the image until I had actually just been trialling it and the idea and adding it onto the page. Yet after adding the spotlight, more on that next, I wanted to look at how I could detail the shadows and maybe expand on what I was intending for that area as well. So since I'd added detail to the light, I kind of followed a similar process for it in the shade around the edge of the drawing as well. And it really worked to give it that little bit of interest there and something to look at for it. Detailing it was fine, and it was simple. And I had been enjoying it until I realised that the shapes I'd added and drawn looked a lot like an eye the more that I built on them. I didn't go into it planning or intending for it to look like an eye or for it to really look like anything. And I didn't really think that anything would really happen with it. So I didn't plan for the eyes at the edges. Yet the more I added it to the image, the more I liked it than I thought I would have. Originally I kept going with it since I figured that it might look cool as a subtle detail that would be more noticed as long as someone looked at it. I didn't want it to be too obnoxious or in someone's face, as I thought that it would work better when blending in. The eyes are to be subtle yet ever present as they continue to observe the scene. I figured that story-wise, they tie well into the performance angle, and that is really where all of this stemmed from as well, since now there is something here to observe. Whether it adds to the story or keeps it the same is something again that is up to you, yet for me they were rather fun to include without having to think too much behind them, as they were on the whim. Yes, I considered where they may have been going and how they were looking, but I pushed them further than I otherwise would, since I knew that I could just as easily delete the layer and remove them if I ended up unhappy with it, or just make them less noticeable and remove some of them. To me though, they were also fun, since the person here is performing, yet the audience isn't seen. I didn't want to pull the image further out and have to draw an audience in the background, but I did want to imply that maybe something is there to watch as she performs on her own terms. The eyes, for the most part, deliver this, whilst you can draw your own opinions on if another audience is there as well. Now, they were actually added after the spotlight. I haven't spoken about that yet, even though most of the shadows details and the amount of them had been done purposefully to balance it in terms of visual interest and detail. Now, the spotlight itself also wasn't in the sketch. I actually only added it in early to the shading phase, as the darker environment had begun to overpower the figure, and it started to kind of lose her a little bit in the terms of priority. It also made sense to me that if she is performing, then there would be a sense of light somewhere to highlight her presence, and to kind of let her be seen, which is the main motivator for it. From there, I wanted to add interest in detail since it felt fun, and I actually thought that I could kind of help bring everything together a little bit more, since the environment didn't have nearly as much detail as the person had, and it felt a little bit unbalanced. Up until that point, the theatre was fairly simple, as there wasn't much that I could do with it. Yes, I could have added more to it or pulled the image out a little bit and added to the stage and the environment. I could have made it landscape and added more of a scenery around it as if she is performing within some sort of production. Yet doing that tended to mean that I lost the figure, and I lost the important parts of the scene and the imagery, and I didn't really know quite how I wanted to take it from that point. So there wasn't much that I could do without overpowering the balance of it all, and it did start to look very imbalanced the more that I worked with the other veins of the idea. But it also felt that the curtains in the background weren't meant to add anything, as they didn't feel too important to the image by the time that I was done with it. They were just kind of there. I thought, until adding the little lines, that there was very little interaction between the person and the space that they occupy, and there wasn't anything saying that it had to be a stage, and they could have been anywhere with a very similar effect on this drawing. If she were in space or a forest, then it wouldn't have changed too much, other than the visual context for the story. In the forest, it would have looked more like practice, or someone kind of dancing in solitude. It could have very much been the same with the space theme as well. And I won't really pretend that adding the light made that much difference, but it sort of helped it a little bit. Besides, I could add things in the light that highlights the threads that little bit more. To me, at the very least, the area and the lines in the light sort of resembles the shapes of the threads, and there was at least a little bit more of a tie between those two sections for both to work well. Naturally, that was when I looked at the shadows to balance it out and to have it work in that way too. They weren't more important details, but they helped the image feel finished more than anything, without having to resort to just blurring the two things together, as that is what I otherwise would have had to do. I would have resorted to blurring the light's edge of the spotlight, when they are usually fairly sharp, and I would have ended up then doing the same to the shading, and gone with the easy route, so to speak. I mean, I still did on the shadow for a little bit, but I also then added a layer of a sharper shadow over the parts where it wasn't with the light. However, as we are getting close to time here, I want to finally talk about the person's details and those things on her dress and her outfit. Ironically, these were the second detail that I ended up settling on for this image, yet the ones that I have ended up then leaving to last. And really that is because I can't explain a lot of it. I did it more because a lot of it felt right before anything else, but I will get into that more as we talk about it here. In this detail, I first had to work out what type of dance they would be doing. I naturally had the pose that started all of this, and that kind of looked as if it was some sort of ballet pose, and I did consider others. However, none of the others that I looked at kind of felt right, and it didn't really fit with this theme. Another one wouldn't have had the same impact as this pose, which meant that I kind of looked at ways I could go for ballet itself, since exploring any other kind of dance didn't fit their idea right. This is then where I started looking at pose references a little bit more, and that was just to be sure that the original one was the route that I wanted. Now this is where in the video I want to address the legs. See, I know that ballet is usually done with a lot of straight legs when the poses are similar to this one, and it's kind of an emphasis of the dance usually. Yet whenever I drew the pose with this detail, it ended up feeling a little bit stiff in the image, and almost too still if that makes any sort of sense. I know it's a key part of the dance style, and the references mostly agreed on it, yet there was one where it wasn't so straight, which stood out a lot more to me than anything else. It's why in this drawing I lowered the leg a little bit and added in that slight bend. I mean, part of using references in art is almost Frankensteining together a load of images until you get something you like more, and also something that you can work with. So I borrowed the arms from some images and the legs from others, since it formed this idea that, again, worked a lot better. I almost preferred this idea that they were still performing for the idea of fun, or focusing on enjoying themselves more than any of the ideals and the details of perfection, and it kind of had remained a large part of this image. Besides, when it was also a small part of everything, then I didn't mind so much because it was just a single leg. In a way, to me, it read a bit more as if they were between poses, or as if they were moving through the dance. That left me with the character's outfit to work out though, however. I had a silhouette of the dress already done and decided, but I wasn't sure what else I wanted to do from there. So at the later parts of the sketches, I started to just do stuff and to throw ideas on the page. In one version, they had a wider belt and more ruffles or layers on the dress than I knew what to do with. In another, it was bows and lace more than anything. I kind of decided that it was fun to look at that, but not quite right. I messed again with flowers or space, and I looked at other themes like those of the ocean and what I could include there. None of those really came to stick though. So that's when I looked at the idea of a lock and key, or chains. I don't quite recall what spurred me to this, but it was a direction I could take that it then came to stick. I liked the way that the chains hung loosely, and once I added the keys to it all, I didn't mind the presence of the lock, since it looked more as if the locks had a key for them on her person too. The chains were decoration more than restrictive, so they made a nice accent when all was said and all was done. And this was very much the same logic for the keys and locks as well. None of it looks as if it's restricting her, which was the important part. The more I worked on it, the more I also felt that it could help push the story a little bit. It may not like anything else, but it also, to me, tied into the idea that was a remnant from the tying to the strings. It was kind of a holdover from the original iteration and the starting version that made this entire idea what it is now. Maybe if we go down the route that she's a puppet come to life, this may have been what she was intended to perform in before the strings had snapped. Maybe they snapped mid-performance if we continue to read it into this aspect. Maybe they did beforehand and she just likes it. Or if it is a person performing of their own enjoyment and agency, it could tie into themes of obligations or rules that come along with so many hobbies or forms of fun. The story really is open to interpretation. I am saying all of this, but you could read it in an entirely different way that I've just not thought of. And I really do think that that's part of the fun of these narrative stories. I can turn around in this voiceover and give 3 or 4 different iterations of stories that I came up with whilst working on this figure. But someone will still turn around with a story that I've not thought of yet, or an interpretation that I couldn't possibly come to the conclusion of, as that just wasn't how I read it. But it's how other people read it, which is really part of the fun for these drawings. And it's also part of why I keep coming back to them and why I enjoy this style digitally. It is really fun to me seeing the conclusions that other people draw over the image that I just don't think of. And truthfully, this image was one that I just kind of went along with the ride for, so the amount of stories that people could get from it can truly be infinite. My logic with this one had been that if I liked it, it would stay, since it had already been very close to disposal once. Because I'd almost quit the idea, I just had fun with it. And like last week, it almost ended up in a weird experimental zone. The outfit was interesting and fun to work on, and I could look at the little details with it for once. The environment, on the other hand, let me work out on adding the little lines to more places. And though I haven't spoken much on it, the image sort of let me identify where I need to work on improving. I haven't said it since I don't like to focus on the negatives very much, but it has highlighted a few things that I can and will consider going forward, so it may not be my best by far. But it was fun all the same, and sometimes a drawing just needs to be fun for the sake of being fun. It can worry about anything else later. And in the future, I can look at environments and interactions with the figure, and also work a little bit more in perspective, since that is one thing that I've repeatedly mentioned I need to include. Though it's again that battle between finding it fun and including it, and really just something that I need to work on more myself. Anyway though, that is all I have time for in today's video. I really hope you've enjoyed it, even if I have spoken in a lot of circles, and I do apologise for any background noise. I live in the quietest of villages until I need to record, and that's just my luck. For now though, tell me what you think, and for now it will be goodbye. I hope to see you next time.